This is critical thinking in the respiratory anatomy lab, and here are a few questions. I have two questions on histology. So this is one, and this is on a model, an x-ray, and another question on histology. So we do a lot of histology in respiratory systems, so that's why I have two questions on histology. So let's look at this first one, where it asks you, what is the function of the cells that the green arrows point to? Now, if you look at the cells that the green arrows are pointing to, notice how these cells are pretty large and they have a well stained round nucleus. So you can see this. So they're pretty large. The blue arrows, on the other hand, are pointing to these cells which are very thin or flattened. Can you see that? You can barely see cytoplasm. All you're seeing is a nucleus, whereas the green arrow is pointing to a cell where you can see quite a bit of cytoplasm. So therefore this cell is not flattened, and hence it is not the type 1 cell, which is the cell that lines the alveolus. So therefore let's look at the choices. The first one, which says forms part of the respiratory membrane, this is not one of the answers, because anything which forms part of the respiratory membrane has to be very thin and flattened, and those cells are the type 1 cells, which are these blue cells, because the respiratory membrane is formed by the basement membrane and the squamous epithelial cell, then the basement membrane of the endothelium and the endothelial cell. So the two basement membranes fuse. So therefore the membrane is very thin, so that gas can pass through and exchange can occur. So therefore it does not, the green arrows do not point to a cell which forms part of the respiratory membrane. The blue one does that, and those are the type 1 cells. The second statement is act as scavengers. It's not that either, because those are dust cells which act as scavengers, and you'll find them wandering inside the alveolus, and if you go to the websites I ask you to go to, you will find these cells. Third, secrete surfactant. Now in the cells which are seen in the alveolus, you have three main types of cells. One are the type 1, which are these squamous cells. Then you have the dust cells, which is not this, and the third is the type 2 cells, and those secrete surfactant. So these are the type 2 cells, and therefore this is the correct answer, because one is, you can see that these cells are quite large, they have enough cytoplasm. So when a cell has to secrete, it has to have a lot of cytoplasm. So it cannot be a cell like this, which has hardly any cytoplasm, like the type 1. And the dust cells, the scavenger cells, are often seen inside because they are wandering macrophages. So anything which will not be the type 2 cell which secretes will not be inside the alveolus, it will line the alveolus. So therefore this is the type 2 cell, and its function is to secrete surfactant. And then the last choice, which says provide strength to the bronchus, this is the alveolus which is shown here. So it's asking you about a cell which is present in the alveolus. So this isn't even the bronchus, hence so this is not the answer either. So therefore the third choice is the correct answer. Let's look at the next question, which asks you, which two regions does the structure that arrow A is pointing to connect? So first you have to obviously identify what this structure is, and if you look at it, it's this. It's an opening that arrow A is pointing to, and it is the opening of the eustachian, or also known as auditory tube, or another way to remember it is it's often called the pharyngotympanic tube. So pharyngotympanic tube, which means it connects, if you remember it this way, it is easy. It connects the pharynx to the tympanum. The tympanum is the middle ear cavity. Now, which part of the pharynx does it connect to the tympanic or middle ear cavity? And if you look, this is the nasal cavity, so the area behind, this is the nasopharynx. This is the oral cavity, so the area behind is the oropharynx. This is the larynx, so the area behind is the laryngopharynx. So that's the laryngopharynx, oropharynx, and this is the nasopharynx. So therefore, just by knowing names, sometimes you can come to the correct answer. So as I said, this is the opening of the eustachian tube which connects the nasopharynx. You can see it's lying in the nasopharynx. This is the nasopharynx. So it will connect the nasopharynx. It's a tube which will pass through and go to the middle ear. So it connects the nasopharynx to the middle ear cavity. So therefore that is the right answer. But let's say you didn't know that, and let's look at the other choices. So it says it connects, the first choice is middle ear with inferior, middle meatus with inferior meatus. This is the middle meatus, and this is the inferior meatus. This opening here is not connecting this middle meatus with this middle meatus. You know, the middle meatus and the inferior meatus and the superior meatus all connect with each other in the nasopharynx. So that's not the right answer. Then the third choice is the sphenoidal and frontal air sinuses. This is the frontal air sinus. This is the sphenoidal air sinus. You can see this is here, so it cannot connect these two. So that also is a ridiculous answer there. And then supraglottic with infraglottic regions. This is part of the larynx. Supraglottic means above the vocal cords, because the area between the vocal cords. This is the vocal cord of one side, this one, because this is a sagittal section. So this is the supraglottic region, this is the infraglottic region. So this, as you can see, is obviously not connecting these two areas. What I would also like you to notice in this picture is this is a sagittal section, so it's showing you the larynx up here. This is the anterior aspect of the larynx, this here is the posterior aspect of the larynx. And here you can see the cartilage is quite well. So this is the thyroid cartilage here, and it's only present anteriorly and on the sides. This is the cricoid here and at the back. You don't see the arytenoid, but the arytenoid sits on top of the cricoid posteriorly. And here you can see this is the epiglottis. So while you're looking at any image like this, you should always try to identify some of the other structures there. And here this is the vestibular fold superiorly and the vocal fold inferiorly. Let's go to the third question, which asks you about pain due to inflammation, which is worse in the morning, will be seen in which of the paranasal sinuses shown here. So let's first identify the sinuses. A is the frontal, B is the ethmoidal. You don't see sphenoidal because it is way inside. And C is the maxillary sinus. Now the answer to this is the frontal sinus, which is A, and the reason is, if you look at the frontal sinus, when it drains into the middle meatus of the nose, so it'll drain down this way, you can see all day the drainage is good because it is draining, you know, by gravity. But at night when you go to sleep and you're lying down, obviously drainage is not, drainage can't occur because you're sort of supine or lying down. So when you get up in the morning, your sinus, when you have sinuses, sinusitis, the sinuses are full, so the pain occurs. So soon as you wake up in the morning, this pain is worst. But as you go through the day, because drainage can occur, then the pain gets better as the day goes along. So that is the reason why frontal sinusitis pain is worse in the morning. Let's look at why ethmoidal and maxillary are not choices. Ethmoidal, these are tiny air cells which are present here. They're very small. They open into the superior and middle meatus this way. So they just open directly, very small, so they can drain quite easily. So there's no problem there. This is the maxillary sinus, and if you notice, another thing is, you can see the floor of the maxillary sinus is lower than the floor of the nasal cavity. So drainage has to go upwards like this. So this drainage, it doesn't matter whether you're lying down or you're standing, it still has to go upwards. So drainage actually of this sinus is at a disadvantage because it has to drain upwards, and since its floor is lower than the floor of the nasal cavity, so it will not change whether it's the morning or the evening. In fact, the best way to drain it is make the person sleep in such a way that, suppose your head is tilted this way, and so this part gets higher, then it makes it easier to drain, and that's known as postural drainage. Let's look at the last question, which says here the structure shown here is part of the conducting zone or respiratory zone. Now when you get questions like this, you should not get thrown off. It really is a simple question. All you need to do first is to identify what this structure is. Now this is a bronchus, and if you notice, the reason it is a bronchus is because it has cartilage. This thing labeled C is cartilage. This piece, you can see one piece of cartilage here. So the moment you see that, you automatically identify it as a bronchus. So a bronchus is part of the conducting zone. Remember, anything from the nasal cavity till the bronchiole, including both, is the conducting zone. Respiratory zone begins from the respiratory bronchiole down to the alveoli. So therefore, once you identify it, you automatically will come to the conclusion that it's part of the conducting zone. So therefore, these are simple tips on how you should identify questions which look a little tricky in the beginning, but they're really very simple.